While almost everyone agrees that the legendary tennis player Arthur Ashe deserves to be honored, there was a question about whether renaming Boulevard was the best way to do that.
And I had a friend that called me and said, do you know they're changing the name of Boulevard? And I said, no, they're not. They wouldn't change the name of Boulevard.
For 6 years, Sue Piteau has called Boulevard home.
We really liked the area. We liked the history that went with the house. We liked the walkability.
As a member of the Boulevard Coalition, she always knows what's going on in the neighborhood.
We were a little surprised. We were very surprised. We were never asked for our opinion or even engaged in the conversation from the very beginning.
Councilwoman Kim Gray proposed renaming the Boulevard in honor of the late Arthur Ashe, a groundbreaking tennis player and Richmond native.
Boulevard is where a lot of the history of Arthur Ashe took place. His beginnings, he was turned away from the tennis courts on the Boulevard and not allowed to play there just based on the color of his skin.
The cost to replace Boulevard road signs? About $300,000.
We're hopeful that that is just an overestimation of their signage costs, and we're working with them to work through any issues on that. But I think he's more than worth the cost and the honor of having those signs changed out.
And as for neighbors?
If they say yes, you should change the name to Arthur Ashe Boulevard, we're fine with that. At that point, we feel like there's been a democratic process, and there's also been the opportunity for all of the citizens of Richmond to weigh in on how do we honor Arthur Ashe appropriately.
Residents will now have 2 years to update their information with the post office.
8 council members voted to approve the name change. 1 abstained. Reporting from Insight's newsroom, I'm Talia Fagart.
That's a story from one of my former Insight students, Talia, and it's a package, so not the story format we're dealing with today, but it does feature the key element we're talking about today, and that is interviews. People are the core of our stories. In broadcast, viewers want to hear from stakeholders, and our job is to bring those voices to the public. Who we choose to hand the microphone to is a big responsibility. And also logistically, it's not as simple as just handing people the microphone. There's an art to finding the right people and then somehow convincing those people to talk to you. So who do we talk to? Think of potential sources as falling into one of 3 main categories. First, we want to seek out people who can talk about their experience. If you cover a house fire, you obviously want to talk to the family that was in the house. If VCU bans smoking on campus, you're going to want to talk to a smoker on campus. If you're covering how student loan reform is going to impact students, talk to a student who's going to be affected by the change. This doesn't mean stand outside and interview the first Joe Schmo with an opinion. We call those man-on-the-street interviews, and there is a place for them, but we want people who are really living the story. Second, we want to talk to people who have expertise. Professors have some expertise.
Yay!
Talking to an MD about a pandemic, talking to a historian about a protest movement, talking to an attorney about a Supreme Court decision. These people may not necessarily be directly involved in the story you're reporting on, but they can provide valuable information. Finally, we want to talk to people with perspectives or opinions. These people are very often experts themselves, but the role that they're playing in your story may be to offer a position, even one that is backed with expertise. For example, I would consider city council members experts on city government. So if you interview them for a story on why passing ordinances takes so long, they would be considered an expert source. But if you interview them for a story on whether they are for or against a new bike lane, for example, they're then offering a perspective. I ordered the types of sources this way for a reason. Talking to ordinary people and telling their stories is always going to be the most important thing that broadcasters do. Talking to people who can share expertise and knowledge is always going to have more value than talking to someone about their opinion. Unfortunately, if you rank how easy it is to find sources and get an interview with them, this list is going to completely flip. We're going to talk about convincing sources to talk to you in a little bit. So for Talia's Arthur Ashe Boulevard story, she talked to Kim Gray, who was a member of the city council pushing for renaming. That was an important perspective. She also talked to a neighbor who wasn't sold on the idea because she wanted more community input, and that was a good angle. That's really all she had time for in this package, but she might have also talked to an expert, someone like a local historian who could offer information about Arthur Ashe or the way in which Richmond has named its streets. There were also a lot of racial equality advocacy groups who were happy about this proposal, so they might be a good choice. I remember at the time there was also some concern about businesses that had a bunch of stationery and envelopes that had been pre-printed with the Boulevard address, so this would be a financial hit for them when they had to change that address. So that was an interesting angle, but the sources Talia got were excellent, and she worked really hard to get them to talk to her. Let's see how good you are at coming up with sources. Take this hypothetical situation that VCU proposes a laptop ban in lecture halls. In your lecture questions Google Doc, come up with at least 3 sources and tell me whether they are experience, expertise, or opinion sources. At least one of the sources should be a specific person. The others can be something like, a student who uses a laptop in class. Then come back and we'll continue. So take a look at your list of potential sources. How are you going to find these people and convince them to talk to you? You might not know how to find them. You might find them, but they never call you back or respond to your email. They might agree to an interview, but it's after your deadline. Sources do this all the time in TV news. They'll be like, cool, I can talk to you tomorrow afternoon. And we're like, well, the news airs at 6 today, so I need to talk to you like right now. Other times you're going to get in touch with someone who just straight up doesn't want to be interviewed, or this is much more common. They'll say their boss won't allow it. And where does that leave us? Often with the same old sources over and over and over again. It's one of the many reasons why we see numbers like these. There isn't a ton of research breaking down the demographics of sources that are quoted in news stories, but this is one example. This chart's breaking down NPR sources by gender for a few of their popular shows. You see a skew toward men. 60% of the sources were men and 40% were women. If you look at things broken down by race, you're going to see most sources quoted in NPR stories were white. The disparity isn't so bad for shows like Code Switch, which was a show that was literally about race. There's a few factors at play here, and I don't have a full-scale content analysis, so I don't want to make any judgments about how far off demographics are from the racial breakdown of the US, but I'm going to take a wild guess and say that they're probably not all that representative. So I mention all this simply to say, look for the voices that aren't always being heard. It's hard when you first start out because you're pretty thrilled when pretty much anybody agrees to talk to you, but pitch stories that allow you to talk to people who aren't in the news all the time. When you're looking for an expert source, dig a little deeper. We're in charge of divvying up time with the microphone, so try and be as mindful as you can about it. So here's how to set yourself up for how to find the right interviews for your story and then how to convince them to actually talk to you. First and foremost, you need to think about sources before you're pitching a story. I have students pitch stories all the time where they think they're going to talk to the governor or Michael Rao or the star of the VCU basketball team, and that's just simply unlikely to happen. It doesn't mean you can't try. It just means don't be super bummed or surprised when it doesn't work out, and definitely have a backup plan. Another common thing that students do is they're going to pitch a story about an environmental proposal, but they haven't even taken the time to look up experts or activist groups in the area, anyone who might serve as sources. So when you pitch stories, I actually have you write out, who could a possible source be? And if you can't think of one, then maybe it's a red flag that you don't need to be covering that story. You do need to do legwork before you begin. You can look at old news stories on the topic, or even just sort of loosely related to your topic, and look at who they talk to. Don't copy them, but they might serve as inspiration so that kind of get you thinking about who you might talk to. The next thing you want to be sure to do is know what the heck you're talking about before you call a source. I mean, if you're covering the laptop ban story and you want to talk to a professor who specializes in learning styles, you don't want to call them and be like, hey, can I talk to you about the laptop ban? You want to say, hey, I know you specialize in how students can best use technology in the classroom. VCU is proposing a laptop ban, and I'm looking for someone who can talk about the pros and cons of laptops in the classroom. That professor is much more likely to talk to you with the second pitch than just saying, hey, yo, can we talk about the laptop ban? When you contact sources, you probably want to talk to them on the phone. I mean, you probably don't want to talk to them on the phone. I also hate the phone, so I don't judge you at all for that. But they're much less likely to say no when you're talking to them on the phone. It's hard to turn someone down face-to-face or on the phone. It's super easy to ignore someone's email. So phone calls are best, but I realize that some of you may prefer email. You can use email to contact sources. You cannot use email to conduct an interview. That's not going to work for radio or TV, so it's not really an option. You also can't use email to send them exact questions, and yes, sometimes they ask. We have ways of getting around this. We tend to give them the parameters of the interview. Sometimes people just want to know what they're being asked to talk about, especially expert sources. They want to know kind of what you want to know. They might ask you for the specific questions. Don't get defensive. Just send them back, oh, actually we're going to discuss this, 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 and this, and I'd like to ask you specifically about this. But you're certainly not going to give them a bullet point of the questions that you're going to ask. You can also use email to gain background information or to confirm information that you already have. So when you're not going to quote a source, but you need to know something, it's totally fine to use email to find that out. If you do email a source, please use the tips that I've given you in this interviewing tip sheet. It's a Google Doc that's linked to on our course website. It's going to cover everything from subject lines to salutations to email signatures. Read it and use it. Now, if you do get in contact with someone but they are reluctant, here are some things that you can do. First, emphasize to them that this is an important story and you want to make sure their voice is heard. Remind them that you're actually interested in what they have to say. Don't tell them that you agree with what they have to say. That's not your role here. But it's perfectly fine to say, hey, your voice matters. I think what you have to say is really interesting and I think people want to hear it. You might also tell them who you've already talked to for the story and which pieces of information you're missing so that they can kind of get a better idea of why you want to talk to them. If you call someone in politics and you're like, hey, I've already talked to the other candidate's team, they're going to be a lot more likely to want to talk to you because they know that their voice is going to be missing from the story. Don't give them questions, but sources are going to be a lot more comfortable when they realize that you're not there to grill them. You're just there to get information from them. Some sources will ask you about remaining anonymous. We do allow this in certain situations, but you would need to get your editor's approval on that. So that would be me. Don't ever agree to an anonymous interview without first checking with your boss. Okay, so they finally agree to an interview. What next? You're gonna go to them, unless you're reporting during a global pandemic, and in that case, you're gonna send them a Zoom link or agree on an outdoor location to meet. You're obviously gonna record the interview, whether on your phone for radio or with a camera for TV. Let them know when you're recording. You should not have your laptop out unless you're using it to record, and if that's the case, don't let the screen face you because you're going to be tempted to look at it. Under no circumstances should you take notes on a laptop. That clickety-clack will absolutely make it into your audio file. Don't drag out the interview or the beginning of the interview. Set everything up, spend a few minutes chatting, and then tell them you're recording and just get going. You might not feel like a professional, but you totally are. You're a student journalist, but you are a real journalist. Every story you do has a potential to be published, whether it's online on YouTube or even on Insight in certain circumstances. So don't call this a class project when you're talking to your sources. It is a report from a student journalist. Do not dress like a fool. I once had a student interview someone while wearing a Christmas sweater where the tree wasn't a regular tree, it was a collage of marijuana leaves. I mean, I laughed when he wore it to class, but I did not laugh when I found out he wore it during an interview. Just throw on a pair of slacks and a shirt or a sweater. Don't wear t-shirts. Try to avoid jeans unless the situation warrants it. Think business casual. What would you wear to a job interview? Of course, also don't show up in a three-piece suit if you're interviewing a farmer, like on a farm. Finally, remember that you can be friendly with sources without being friends. With few exceptions, you shouldn't be interviewing people that you know well anyway. These are sources, and even if you like or agree with them, remember that you're there to interview them in an official capacity.
First and last name, please.
Erica O'Donnell.
And can you spell first and last?
Firstlast.
I meant your first and last name.
That one kills me. Yeah, the first question you want on a recording is the person saying and spelling their first and last name. If they've got a name that's tough to pronounce, ask them to say it slowly so you can be sure to get it right in the video. And just tell them that's what you're doing, right? Be like, I've got to pronounce your name on tape. I want to make sure I'm saying it properly. Then you want to confirm their title, as in, how are you going to introduce them? If you're talking to someone at a beer festival about how much fun they're having, then I don't really care that they're an accountant. I'm going to introduce them as Joe Schmo, who came to the festival to try out Triple Crossing's latest IPA. I'm not going to say, Joe Schmo is an accountant who also drinks beer. For that story, no one cares that he's an accountant. So if my story is about a new tax law and I'm interviewing Joe for that, then yeah, I'm going to say he's an accountant and probably where he works. But some people can also be really specific about titles, so make sure to ask. If Joe Schmo is like, I'm actually the Associate Assistant Director of Logistical Operations at, and you're just like, stop, I can't fit that many words in my script. So we're going to shorten the title. So when I say title, you want to think role in the story. So during an interview, you do want to have questions written out in advance. I like to have 5 to 6 questions ready to go, especially anything you absolutely need answered, like if you've got some specific detail to clear up. But you also want to listen and follow up on things that they mention. It's an interview, but think of it as a conversation where one person is doing much of the talking. You want to be empathetic and interested, but also professional. So nod your head, smile, make eye contact, and don't look bored or like you want to interject constantly. One good tip is to ask their name and all that, but then start out with something just to warm them up. Ask them to describe what they do, or a little bit about how they became interested in their field, or something broad. Like if I'm interviewing someone at a protest, I'm going to start with something like, tell me what brought you out here today, or tell me what today has been like for you. In other words, ask people about their experience. People are really good at talking about themselves. Body language is really important. Try not to cross your arms. Don't do anything annoying like shake your leg or tap your pen. Remain interested even when all you're thinking is, oh my gosh, this dude is rambling and I'm going to have to transcribe all this stuff that I'm not even going to be able to use. Ask questions and then shut up. This is one good reason why you want to write out questions in advance. You're going to try not to read them from your notebook like a robot, but having them written out will force you to think about your phrasing and prevent you from rambling. Remember not to verbally agree with ums and hms and uh-huh. We naturally do this to encourage our conversational partners, but the sound is going to end up on your audio track. There are few things worse than ruining a good soundbite with a nice mm-hmm in the background. It's so frustrating, and every young reporter does it, so don't let that be you. Do not be afraid to ask for clarification. So saying something like, what you just said now is really important. I want to make sure I get it right. Could you go back through that real quick? Is a way to, 1, actually make sure you get it right, and 2, allow the source to repeat key info that might make for a good soundbite. People often say things better the second time around. You can't say, hey, that's a good soundbite. Can you please repeat it, but with fewer words? But by asking people to go over something again, you can often get a better bite. Now, don't ask someone to repeat a 5-minute monologue, but honing in on something key and asking them to walk you through that quickly can often work. So I told you no laptops, but that doesn't mean you can't take notes. Technically, you don't need to take notes. You're recording, so if taking notes is going to stress you out, just don't do it. If you do take notes, you might jot down follow-up questions so that you don't have to interrupt your source. Like this might be a word or two so that you can remember to ask them later. You can also write down timestamps if you're looking at a timer. Like when the source says something really good, you might write down like 2:47, so you know to go back to that part of the interview later and you don't have to search through the whole thing. You could also write down keywords instead of timestamps so that you can kind of jog your own memory, like, hey, I think they said something really good when they were talking about this word. You might also write down words that remind you to fact check something. So if the source mentions a number or references a statistic, you're definitely going to want to check that out. And sometimes sources during an interview might mention additional resources that you could look into. So they might give you contact information or mention the name of a website or something, and you could write that down. As for what to ask them, the age-old advice of open-ended questions still applies. Here are a few prompts that work. Tell me about, what do you think about? Could you walk me through? Would you explain? How? Why? What? What's your take on this? I generally find that sources are going to ramble more than they're going to give you yes/no answers. So open-ended questions are good because they help you set up your source to give you good information and good sound bites, not necessarily because they help prevent yes/no answers from really terse subjects. That said, We do sometimes actually want yes/no answers, and a lot of times we don't get yes/no answers, especially from politicians. So when you need to know something specific, it's totally fine to ask a closed-ended question. So if you need to know, would we need a tax increase to make that happen? I mean, you're not going to get a yes/no answer on that, but you ideally would want one. When will the construction be finished? I need a date. Is that past the original deadline? Again, yes, no. You just need that information. So in that case, closed-ended questions are totally fine. When it's time to wrap up an interview, ask your source if there's anything they want to add. Here are some examples of how to do that. That takes care of my questions. Is there anything else you want to add? Is there anything else I should cover in my story that I didn't ask you about? Is there anything else you think people should know about this topic? Thank them, then stop recording, and then get out of there. Once the interview is over, you do need to transcribe it, and that means you have to get out a number 2 pencil, a stack of college ruled paper, and write down your interview word for word, staple it, and then turn it in to me. I am screwing with you. That is not going to happen. We have a crazy thing called technology nowadays. You do not have to do that. All you have to do is use the free automated transcription service that I am going to tell you about. So first, I do want to explain to you why I make you transcribe. It's not just busy work. I don't believe in busy work. First and foremost, you should cringe a little bit whenever you're transcribing your interviews. Listening to yourself on tape can be a little awkward, but it's going to make you a better interviewer to realize what you could have done differently. It's also going to encourage you to keep your interviews short. I had a student a couple years ago who had to transcribe an hour-long interview, and guess what? Her interviews got a lot shorter after she did that. But of course, the primary function of transcribing an interview is to find your sound bites. It's a lot easier when you have a transcription, and especially when you get to insight. I'll have a student give me a package and they picked a terrible soundbite, and I want to pick a different one, but I don't have time to listen to their full interview. So I look through the transcript for a soundbite, and then we pick it from there. The same thing's going to happen in a newsroom. Your editor, your producer might want a different soundbite later, and they're not going to have time to listen to it. So the transcript helps with that. A lot of times, someone else is actually taking content from your story and creating another story out of it. So for example, maybe you did a VO, a voiceover for the 5 o'clock newscast. Someone else is going to turn that into a VOSOT with a soundbite for the 6 o'clock newscast, and they don't have time to listen to your interview. So the transcript's going to help them do that. Okay, now I'm going to show you the transcription service called Otter AI. You can navigate to the website if you want, or download it as an app on your phone while I give you a short tour.
I'm going to show you Otter.ai. That's Otter, like the animal, or like Hermione's Patronus for the Harry Potter fans among us. This is Otter on desktop. It also comes on an app with much the same features. You do not need a premium account. I repeat, do not pay for this. Just do the free account. You get 600 minutes of transcriptions a month, which is more than enough. There are 2 ways to transcribe an Otter. You can either upload a file, which is one way, but it can take a little time, especially for those MOV or the MP4 files. For MP3s, which are audio files, it doesn't take nearly as long. I think you only get 3 free imports total, not 3 free imports a month, but I could be wrong about that. But that is one way to do it if you... That's my son. Calvin? Okay, he's fine. So the other way you can do it is you can record. So I'm going to hit record, and Otter is going to record what it's hearing, and it does a pretty good job, honestly. So if I do it this way, you notice I'm talking, but you obviously won't be talking to Otter. You'll be playing it a clip. So if you have a clip that you want to transcribe on your phone or on your camera, you can just play it, and Otter's going to hear it, and it's going to transcribe what it's hearing. Alternatively, you might have those clips on your computer, and then say you want to record on Otter on your phone, or vice versa. You just play it.
Editors, meaning they're editing video. We have people who are writers who do headlines. They write individual stories within the rundown, and then we have reporters. And so at 12:30, we all get on a call. We make our decision about how the show is staffed.
Okay, So when Otter is done recording, it saves it in conversations, and it takes it a little bit to process the recording because it's going to try to determine who the different speakers are. I mean, not their names, but the fact that they are different speakers. So I have one that I did a little bit earlier, and as you can see, it's got me and then it has Chance. So you can actually tag the speakers, which is really cool. Another thing you can do is highlight a comment. So if there's a soundbite you want to use, you highlight, oh, look at that. Here's adding a comment. So when Otter is processing this file, what it's doing is matching the words to the part of the tape where they occur. So look at this.
Later. So what you can do here, the editorial team, you know, the host is the only person. I'm part of a large editorial team. You know, the host is the only.
It makes it so much easier to sort through your interviews when you have it in a transcription service like this. And the fact that it's free is really remarkable. You will have to go through and clean up the copy a little bit. It's not going to be perfect. I do require you to turn in transcripts with your assignment. That is my son slamming a cabinet door over and over again. You just come up here, go to export text. A TXT file is fine because you're just going to copy and paste this into a Google Doc. Do include the speaker names. I do not care about timestamps. Merging same speaker segments can be good. Go ahead and export it that way. Copy and paste it into the bottom of your Google Doc when you turn in your radio or your TV stories, and you're done. I do want to mention one more tip about Otter. Some students who have it as an app on their phone will hit record at the beginning of an interview so that by the time that they wrap up the interview, they've already got the transcript ready. Obviously, this doesn't work if you're using your phone as a camera or to record using voice memos or something, but it is a good tip. This should be an easy lecture question if you've been paying any attention for the past few minutes. True or false, you must turn in an interview transcript with your radio and TV stories. Just write true or false in your lecture question document.